When most people think of manhwa or Korean comics, they think of long, colorful strips of panels that are meant to be enjoyed on your phone, but manhwa has an older history that not a lot of people know about. For example,
I think this is where manhwa really shines. At its worst, I think it tries too hard to replicate the experience of a normal comic, but it's at its best when it does its own thing, when it's really willing to use the format of a webcomic to its fullest potential.
Not all manhwas are webcomics, as in the past they used to be printed and read like regular books. Also, the manhwa Alex showed was from before manhwa became primarily digital. At its best, manhwa innovates, regardless of being vertical or horizontal. Both the manhwas that are used in the clip are exceptional in their own ways, but not a lot of people know about old school manhwas. From 1910 to 1945, Japan occupied Korea. During this time, a lot of Japanese influences were introduced to Korean culture, including manga. During this time, political manhwas were very popular, until the government outlawed them. After the Japanese occupation ended, manhwa for kids started to become popular. Manhwa was also present during the Korean War, being used to lift troop spirits. Over the course of the 1900s, manhwa would develop into many different genres and become a popular medium around the country. Then, in 2004, webtoon launched, and it quickly became popular among Korean manhwa readers. But it isn't as simple as that. In the late 1900s, Korea was going through an economic crisis. In the past, manhwa was accessible to the average consumer, but because of the crisis, people were not able to afford luxuries like manhwa. In the same vein, the ban on Japanese comics had been lifted, so manhwa now had to compete with manga. This, coupled with a financial crisis, resulted in the manhwa industry starting to crumble. People began scanning and sharing manhwa on the internet, which meant people didn't have to spend any money to read manhwa. Manhwa shops began to go out of business, but then some rich investors came to the rescue and created a new way to read comics, vertically. While webcomics had existed for a while, a site called Dom launched, and after some successful stories, it became pretty popular. A year later in 2005, Naver Webtoon launched, and after incredible success, it was able to adapt for smartphones, merge with competitors, and take over the world. At least that's how Webtoon tells it in the super weird comic they made. They kinda subtly diss traditional style manhwas too, which leads us to the next topic. As a medium changes, there will be those who innovate and those who exploit the system. Modern manhwas like Solo Leveling, Infinity, and Distant Sky are examples of manhwas that pushed boundaries and really changed up what could be done with the vertical style. But there are also a lot of manhwas that take advantage of the webtoon monetization model. For instance, webtoon creators get paid per chapter, and because of this, some creators will put out short, low-quality chapters every few days. Some creators will compensate for the shortness by using recaps, which will include a significant amount of reused content. It's okay to reuse stuff, but if half a chapter is a recap, you're probably doing something wrong. Similarly, negative space is often used to pad chapters. Remember this clip?
I think this is where manhwa really shines. At its worst, I think it tries too hard to replicate the experience of a normal comic, but it's at its best when it does its own thing, when it's really willing to use the format of a webcomic to its fullest potential.
Well, the manhwa Alex dissed was Vagrant Soldier Aries. Although Alex dismissed it for being a traditional comic and sticking to conventions, in reality, it is known for being pretty unique, not only for its story but also artistically, especially through the paneling. By using slight angles and a heavy use of asymmetry, the artist, Ryu Kim-chul, was able to make fights seem dynamic and help keep the story feeling fast-paced, even things were actually slow. If you ever read Azumi, it's sort of like that. The paneling was also used to build tension and really shined during the climax of the story. Although the art itself is in line with the old-school Korean style, Kim-chul stood out with his minimalist style that really combined medieval and modern fashion. Even to this day, Kim-chul is a manhwa artist, with the last project he worked on being martial artist Lee Kwok. Like many others, Kim-chul adapted to the modern vertical age, and seeing his art in full color is really cool. He kept his old school style, and as pointed out by a Mal user, the manhwa's art stands out in a sea of similar styles. Unfortunately, just as it was hitting its peak, Lee Kwok was cancelled. I would like to point out that Kim-chul is a good example of innovation in both the horizontal and vertical age. It isn't that one format is better than the other, as both have their pros and cons. The thing is that one format is just being forgotten. Let's take a step back and look at an old school manhwa. Chunchu Genocide Fiend is a manhwa about a man named Chunchu, who was cursed from birth. He is born with the power of the Demon Stone, which makes him pretty much invincible. Despite this power, Chunchu is a pariah, and because of this, he has many violent encounters. Because of the story's themes, the quality of the art, and the graphic violence, Chunchu is a pretty popular old school manhwa. One of the wildest parts about Chunchu are the battles, which are incredibly graphic. Unfortunately, if Chunchu existed on Webtoon, it would be banned immediately, and for good reason. Webtoon has a lot of rules about censorship and bans graphic violence. This isn't a problem, as it makes sense that a company would want to have its own rules that artists must follow. But the thing is, Webtoon has been making their rules stricter and stricter over time, resulting in artists having to go to extreme measures to be able to tell their stories on a platform. One article outlines how artists have to censor clothed characters because they were deemed too provocative, and other authors have had to pixelate or straight up remove mildly violent scenes. This not only prevents authors from telling the stories they want to tell, but disrupts the reading experience as well. Because of the stranglehold Webtoon has on the manhwa industry, it's able to censor a lot of different comics. Remember chunchu from earlier? Well, that series was never completed because the author and illustrator had a falling out. In interviews, they said that they would never finish the series. But while I was making this video, that changed. I'm unsure if this information is correct, as the website is a bit sketchy, and I'd have to pay to read chapters. But from the looks of it, the duo has come back together to turn chunchu into a vertical webtoon. I can't really say much about it due to the paywall though. Remember how I talked about the financial crisis that caused the Korean manhwa industry to suffer? Well, I left out one detail: the Juvenile Protection Act. This act resulted in the censorship of comics aimed at adults, and because of this, a lot of Korean artists moved to Japan in order to create comics. One of those artists was Boichi, the creator of Sunken Rock and Dr. Stone. If you ever read any of his comics, they are definitely for an adult demographic, and because of this, they tackle adult themes and issues. These themes do not have a place in the modern webtoon and manhwa landscape. You have to look very hard to find modern manhwas that are specifically made for adults, and there's a reason why younger individuals gravitate more towards manhwa, and as they age, they begin to read manga. On a different note, there are a lot of different cultural elements that you don't really see in modern manhwas. You miss out on a lot of history and traditions. This is because modern manhwas are made for the global market, so they tried to appeal to a larger audience. This contrasts a lot of older manhwas, which were made specifically for Koreans. This resulted in a lot of Korean culture being present in those stories, and a good example of this is Leon, which integrates culture and history with a modern setting, or at least a modern for an old school manhwa. All of this really just comes down to personal preference and what a reader wants to see in their comics. You should read old school manhwa because of the history, the quality, the lack of censorship, the unique innovations, and the different cultural elements that you just don't find anymore. There are obviously exceptions for these themes, and there are a load of good and bad horizontal and vertical manhwa alike. In my opinion, both formats are pretty good and interesting, but older manhwas are definitely a lot more slept on to a frustrating degree. Thank you all for watching, and your recent support. Later, gamers.